We will be resuming our session. If you may all be seated and exchange your business cards after the meeting. Voilà. Thank you very much. We're now going to discuss the purposes and extent of Western strategy. And when I was looking at the topic, a rather absurdist aphorism came to my mind, which is the following. He who does not know where he wants to go is unlikely to get there. Capabilities without strategy are unlikely to produce desired effects, and strategy without capabilities may at best end up as an exercise in vanity, but probably something worse. In order to discuss the purposes and extent of Western strategy and military capacity, we have three remarkable speakers. Strachan is with us. He'll be here in a second, don't worry. We have, first of all, Minister Eriksen Søreide, Minister of Defense of Norway. And I take the opportunity under your presence to once again, as others have already done here, to say how much we have been appreciating Norway's hospitality and welcome and substantive contribution to our proceedings here. Secondly, Michael Rich, member of the Council of the IISS, President and Chief Executive Officer of RAND, whom many of you know, who will be speaking under the control of the former President and Chief Executive Officer of RAND, Jim Thompson, who is in this room as well, and Professor Sir Hugh Strachan, also a member of the Council of the IISS, Chichele Professor of the History of War at All Souls College at the University of Oxford, where he was one of the successors to Robert O'Neill, former director of the IISS and chairman of the Council of the IISS. Hugh Strachan, as you may have noticed in the bookshops, which are groaning under numerous books on the centennial of the beginning of the First World War. One of the most prominent books has been that of Sir Hugh Strachan. But I invite you not to stop simply at reading the book that you will find in all of the bookshops these days, but to actually, you may have to order it on Amazon, to get his earlier book, which goes back 3 or 4 years, I speak under your control, which is the first volume of an extensive history of the First World War, and which, of course, gets into the issues of how the bloody thing began. To discuss our topic here, of course, you will bring the depth, the historical depth, and the ability to avoid the traps of analogy that we have been referring to here over the last 2 days. But now, without further ado, Madame Eriksen Søreide, if you wish to take the podium, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to host you all here, and I'm very glad that you've felt the hospitality. I was a bit worried, though, on Friday, because the weather was unusually hot for this time of year, about 20 degrees. Now this is more like it should be, and is usually at this time of year. So I think it's a good idea for you to take both with you as a memory of the time here in Norway. It's not an easy task to speak at the closing session after 2 days of such a broad array of important topics that has been discussed. I will nevertheless offer my remarks on the extent to which Western countries are ready and capable to triumph over the challenges ahead. And let there be no doubt that the security landscape in Europe has changed. Recent months, we've seen that our shared vision of a Europe whole and free is challenged by those who disregard the rule of law. And the unison condemnation of Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine during the NATO summit leaves pretty much no room for interpretation. And likewise, the instability that we see in our southern neighborhood is causing grave concern. ISIL's disregard for human rights and human life is unacceptable to all of us. And after nearly 2 decades of conducting out-of-area operations, NATO is now again focusing on possible threats to our own territory. And NATO has restarted contingency planning for the defense of Europe in the wake of the crisis in Ukraine. And I believe that that is a very strong signal. But I'm not sure that our societies has fully grasped the depth of this signal. The thought of conflict in the midst of Europe is probably too painful to contemplate. We had hoped, all of us, that this chapter was behind us. And in a time when security challenges are increasing, 21 of 28 member countries in NATO will likely spend less on defense in 2014 than they did in 2008. European allies will in total spend an average of 13% less than in 2008. And I say at every ministerial I attend, I say almost at every conference I attend, that the cuts need to be reversed and European allies need to carry more of the burden of the transatlantic relationship. Previously, we saw that former secretaries of defense in the US gave books and chapters where they addressed the burden sharing issue. Now we see that current secretaries of defense have this as part of their speaking points. This is something that is concerning all of us. If we should have success against today's military or otherwise security challenges, political and economical tools needs to be backed up by credible military power. On Europe's eastern border, we'll be faced with a different Russia, a Russia that has shown its cards. It has demonstrated not only the will to use military force to achieve political goals outside its own borders, but also the ability. Even when the dust settles, even when the aggression in Ukraine comes to an end, our relations with Russia will be of a different character. If we look back, the Russian military capacity could best be described as a sledgehammer. It was capable of a massive blow, but it was both imprecise and it took a long time to prepare. Now, the Russian modernization program has made its military forces more precise and versatile. Military forces can also be employed at a far quicker notice. In simple terms, Russia has now more military options. Russia has, through SNAP exercises and operations, shown the ability to quickly concentrate large forces on a high level of readiness close to Allied territory. Without prior notification, these things are very destabilizing for European security. Firmness and predictability has been key words in our relations with Russia. And that is why we also emphasize the importance of existing treaties on arms control and confidence and security building measures. We encourage Russia to use these frameworks to show transparency as well as predictability with regard to ongoing and future exercise activities and operations. South of Europe, we see an arch of failed and weak states stretched from West Africa to Central Asia. They're presenting instability, terrorism, and armed conflicts. This represents a grave threat to civilians in the regions, to our interest in the region, and also to the security of our homelands. Especially the brutal and devastating wars in Syria and Iraq are of great concern. ISIL's brutalism in Syria and Iraq goes beyond human imagination. To prevent these failed states from destabilizing neighboring countries or being used as safe havens for terrorism, there will be a demand for international assistance for years to come. All in all, we see a very complex mosaic with a combination of conventional and unconventional means, state and non-state actors, of little or no warning time. We can say, summed up, that it's an illustration of how in today's world, geographical distance does not always constitute safety. Even though NATO will refocus its attention on collective defense and its own territory, NATO will not disengage from the rest of the world. NATO security starts far beyond its own borders. Crisis management remains an essential task for the organization. The will, the ability to assist others builds up under NATO's cohesion and credibility. This is also the case for military operations outside of the NATO framework. But I think we all see that the military strategic dilemma for the West has changed. In previous times, we developed our military forces to withstand divisions of main battle tanks. War was, in a way, declared when the battle tanks move over a border. There was something predictable about it. It takes time to assemble large forces, and their axes of advance are limited in numbers. Today, a potential aggressor has greater freedom of choice for attacks in terms of time, type, and place. The introduction of new technology has fundamentally altered the way we think about defense. New technology opens up for opportunities that we previously thought unimaginable, but it also makes us vulnerable. Attacks, whether they are conventional or through cyberspace, against our navigational or communication systems, they could impact the ability of governments to respond in times of crisis and war. Development within the field of long-range precision fires creates the opportunity for attacks with little or no warning. Smaller and mid-sized countries with limited resources will increasingly have difficulties in fully protecting and defending themselves in all domains. And the massive increase in costs for military hardware are especially challenging for smaller nations. There's a major difference in the role of technology in the corporate and in the military sector. In the corporate sector, technology has been cost reducing, whereas in the military sector, it's driving up costs. As our platforms become more expensive, many nations risk reaching a critical mass, the point where it no longer makes sense to operate a system nationally. And in order to maintain the full spectrum of military capabilities, there's a greater need to specialize or to integrate with close allies. Smaller NATO states will require allied reinforcement at a very early stage during a crisis. And it's important that we already in peacetime make the proper arrangements to ensure the reinforcements can arrive quickly. This will be a strong signal to a potential aggressor that there will be a multinational response. Norway seeks to deepen our security and defense cooperation with those allies that play a key role in defending Norway in a crisis. We need forces that can respond swiftly to a crisis buildup close to or on our territory. Our military actions must seek to deter a potential aggressor. Keeping forces on a high level of readiness is costly, but it could help prevent a crisis or conflict from breaking out. And these developments represent a great challenge to how we developed our armed forces. I believe that Norway and other European states could be on the verge of a larger reorientation of our defense organizations, particularly how we look at multinational cooperation. The economic rationale for deeper cross-national defense cooperation is clear, and this goes for all aspects of warfare, from procurement to maintenance, training, and operations. It may even require greater reliance on our close allies to provide some capabilities. Over time, this may be required for NATO as well, to maintain NATO's full spectrum of capabilities. And the discussions in NATO over the past time has been to fill the capability gap, how to do it. As an alliance, we need to utilize the economies of scale. But more importantly, and this is my final point, in a globalized world, instability and conflict are rarely neatly confined within national borders. Solving some of today's more pressing challenges requires a concerted and multinational effort. We do this best with our close allies, with whom we share the values of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. It requires a NATO that can perform the full spectrum of its tasks: collective defense, crisis management, and building security with others. This is why Norway is investing and will continue to invest in our NATO membership. The NATO summit that we have just been to is, in my opinion, the most important NATO summit in recent years. I know that has been stated before, but this time is different. And it is different because the security landscape in Europe has fundamentally changed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm sure there'll be a number of questions from the floor, possibly some queries about whether this time it really was different in terms of the summit. Michael Rich, over to you.
Thank you, Francois. I'm honored to be on the panel with both the Minister as well as Professor Strachan. In his invitation, Adam Ward posed the following questions to me. What, in the face of myriad global challenges, are the basic interests of the West? And what does it need to organize and equip itself to secure those interests? Even if I had more than the 8 minutes he allotted me, defining the basic interests of the West, I think, would certainly elude me. My predecessor at RAND, Jim Thompson, convinced me that I probably couldn't even come up with a definitive list of which nations comprise the West. And even if I could do that, it's not clear that the West shares a cohesive set of interests, something that I think we're seeing play out in crisis after crisis. So let me instead try to describe, just as a starting point, my personal interpretation of the basic interests of the United States, my home country. This, I think, isn't an easy task either, unless the objective is to spark a debate or start an argument. Then I think it's going to be pretty easy. Now, in my judgment, at the most elemental level, the overriding interest of the United States, among many other countries, is preserving and developing a liberal international order. And to me, this encompasses democratic governance, basic security, rights of individuals, such humanitarian values as open debate and tolerance, competitive economies guided by market principles, all subject to the rule of law. Now, some in the United States would say that preserving order, period, is actually the most elemental and basic interest, that a liberal order would merely be icing on the cake. And I do think that gets the sequence right. Samuel Huntington pointed out, of course, that men can have order without liberty, but they cannot have liberty without order. And Frank Fukuyama's new book that will be out in a few weeks essentially makes the same point. But nonetheless, my own view is that a liberal order in the end will be more stable, more productive, and more fulfilling to individuals, families, and communities than an authoritarian one. And to me, that makes order more of an intermediate objective than the salient interest. But to venture beyond these generalities, what are basic American international interests at this point in time? First, a constructive relationship with China. I list that first because of China's scale, which was succinctly summarized by my council colleague, Dr. Li, in the panel preceding this one. A stable, prosperous China has much to offer the rest of the world. If America's relationship with a rising China evolves in a positive way, the two countries that could more effectively tackle a whole range of pressing global problems that require their cooperation. Conversely, a hostile relationship with China would undermine strategic stability in the Pacific region, and it would in turn drain resources away from cooperative opportunities that promise mutual benefits, and instead divert those resources to what would be a very expensive, unfortunate competitive military competition, two very different paths. So at the top of the agenda with China is a modus vivendi in East Asia, where China's claims to huge expanses of territory, international waters, plus everything on top of them and everything underneath them, are clearly serious challenges to the global order, even without war so far. Now, next on my list is an intertwined set of interests related to the Middle East, a region of several 100 million people, where there are practically no liberal democracies at all. In the near and medium term is the isolation and eventual eradication of the most violent forms of anti-Western extremism. I'm referring here to the kind manifested by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, franchises, and mimics. Over the longer term is the amelioration of sectarian and ethnic strife in the greater Middle East, especially between and among Sunnis and Shiites, Muslims and religious minorities in that region, and Israelis and Palestinians. And this will require a combination of political, ideological, and military instruments. The instruments will have to be wielded by a coalition. The coalition will have to include both Western and regional actors. And there will have to be sustained attention not only to the manifestations, but also to the sources, the root causes of the fanatical disaffection that leads to radicalization, violent intolerance of heterogeneous societies, and in many cases, violent antipathy towards the West. Now, aside from East Asia and the Middle East, the stakes for America are highest in the other axis of the liberal international order, of course, Europe. So third on my list is a Western orientation of the former Soviet East European states. This implies blunting, discrediting, undermining, and eventually defeating what has been called Putinism, and the dangers that it poses to the maintenance and development of a liberal international order. The United States also, of course, has a basic interest in preventing further spread of nuclear weapons and weapons-related technology, especially in regions of instability. So that's 4. Fifth, sustained economic and political development, preferably via the Western model, to overcome poverty and related instability where it persists, especially in Africa and South Asia, as well as in the Arab world. And 6, development and then maintenance of an ample and secure sources of clean energy. I haven't said finally yet because I could go on, but the list may be too long already for effective management, so I'll stop there. Now, the latter half of Adam's question focused on the implications of a set of interests like this for organizing and equipping the West. And just a few thoughts on that part of the question. First, for the United States to make steady progress in pursuit of these interests, it is going to have to reinvigorate its economy. That not only means structural, financial, fiscal, and immigration reforms, it means reversing the erosion in the accountability and the effectiveness of our public institutions of government, and it will need other Western countries to do the same, while also agreeing to open flows of trade and information. Next, there needs to be a new Western understanding of burden sharing, and I regard this as urgent. In the United States, I believe this means includes a reconsideration of plans to shrink even further the American defense budget and the size of our armed forces, especially the U.S. Army. And for Europe, it means a reversal of the contractions in defense spending and the associated erosion in defense capabilities, and I was pleased to hear the minister echo this point. It's essential that we develop flexible, effective, and precise alternatives to military force. It's something my colleague at RAND, David Gompert, calls P2C, instruments of P2C, the power to coerce. Together, we must develop a strategy to strengthen local defense capabilities in contested regions, beginning with Eastern Europe and East Asia. And finally, there needs to be a renewed and cooperative military transformation that would be led by the United States, but with serious sustained commitments from NATO nations as well. We face ongoing terrorist threats in many areas of the globe, emerging nuclear threats in Asia and the Middle East, a range of coercive threats by Russia that could be carried out by a form of hybrid warfare, advanced anti-access area denial threats posed most notably by China, but likely by others in the near future, as well as growing cyber threats and vulnerabilities. So I don't have time to get into specifics, but a candidate list of priority mission areas for our transformation efforts might include counterterrorism, power projection, counterproliferation, cyber operations, and nuclear forces. So that's my 8-minute list of interests and thoughts about how to organize and equip to secure them. Adam, give me a harder one next time. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I'll pretend that Adam Ward didn't tell you anything and ask you a slight add-on question, and that is, how are we doing?
Well, I think we have progress to make in every one of the points that I made, Francois, and the progress begins with changes in the way the United States goes about things, but that needs to be matched by changes in our partners and allies around the world as well.
Thank you. To paraphrase a French strategist, Capitaine Beaufre, you have given us a splendid demonstration of économie des forces, which is one of the basic principles of strategy, maximum effect with the minimum resources. In this case, the resource of time was very limited, but the effect, I think, was impressive. Strachan, over to you.
That's on, yes. As Francois said, the centenary of the First World War has done wonders for the book sales of those of us who write about the subject. It's also hijacked our diaries, and one of the questions that I'm fed up with answering is, do we in 2014 confront a sort of 1914 perfect storm, a concatenation of crises across Asia and the Middle East, which could all come together? Francois also warned us against easy analogies, or actually stupid analogies, that fail to understand change over time and try to stress continuity and work selectively. But there are still three basic points which I think the First World War can do duty for, or do duty today. The first is one that Sarah Rain has already quite rightly mentioned, which is that economic interdependence does not mean no war. If we have had a globalized world before, we most certainly had it in 1914, when the vast majority of significant states were interlocked by London as the World Trading Center, and where most were on the gold standard. The second observation, which I would make out of the First World War centenary, is that no state in 1914 actively wanted a world war. And what actually seems to be much more significant in understanding the causation of this war is the capacity of small states to manipulate the actions of bigger ones, particularly, of course, in July 1914 itself, of Serbia, to motivate Russia into action at a point where many in Russia, on the conservative side, feared revolution, and where, of course, Bolsheviks welcome war precisely because it might lead to revolution. And the capacity of those junior allies effectively constrained and boxed in the freedom of action in many respects of major allies. War also began in many ways as local conflict, indeed a series of local conflicts, which were then aggregated. A Balkan war became a European war, and states entered for reasons that were as much divergent as convergent. Britain, when it entered the war, did not do so because of Serbia, but because, if anything, of Belgium. Japan entered the war because of interests in North China and Pacific. I realize that's a bit close to the bone after the last session. And the Ottoman Empire, of course, entered the war because it wished to reassert itself in what it saw as its own domain, stretching from the Balkans to North Africa. So my conclusion from much of that is the pressure to keep separate what could be separate rather than to permit conflicts to aggregate and join together. And here the rhetoric associated with major war can so easily get in the way. In 1914, the great powers of Europe spoke very quickly of a war for democracy, for culture, for civilisation, all the phrases which still have redolence today, including, of course, the rule of international law, the justification so favoured by Britain in 1914. What they did was ensure that conflicts which might have remained specific, might have remained reconcilable, became absolute, that localized conflicts became global. The rhetoric of the global war on terror, of the long war, similarly has the capacity to aggregate conflicts rather than to disaggregate them. And if there is a conclusion I draw from all that, is that we desperately need a political vocabulary for war which contains it rather than magnifies it, and magnifies it above all for domestic political effect. In 2014, leaders of Western states, and that was the brief from Adam that we should think about Western states, are locked in a double bind by their electorates. They perceive their peoples as unwilling to condone further interventions on the back of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan especially, and so they play up the reasons for action while playing down the levels of commitment which they are prepared to make. They effectively use the rhetoric of, if you like, 1914, which then exceeds the substance, unlike 1914, and thank God, of course, of what will be delivered. In other words, the declaratory strategies of the West overpromise and underdeliver. They overpromise precisely because they are directed domestically, but at the same time, they cease to be rhetorics which become effective guidelines for action. From Afghanistan to Iraq, from Libya to Ukraine, the gap between declaratory intent and applied effort has become enormous. As a result, we read successive accounts of Western tactical and operational successes in individual actions which fail to deliver meaningful strategic outcomes. I too, I think at this point, will go to a list of what I think are 6 words or sets of words, and the ways in which we do them, which seem to me to amplify that point and to confront us with a degree of ambiguity in what we're trying to achieve. The first word that I think we need to think about much more seriously is deterrence, because by speaking big and raising the ante, and then not following up on the declaration, the West does, of course, undermine the deterrent effect of its own capabilities. Last year, President Obama's red lines in Syria, drawn up in relation to Assad's use of chemical weapons, had the effect of diminishing the deterrence capability of US power more generally, and arguably created a permissive environment for actions elsewhere, not least in Ukraine. The historical analogy for deterrence is perhaps less 1914, when President Poincaré was determined to keep Britain, France, and Russia together precisely in the hope that it would deter Germany and Austria-Hungary from action, and more the 1930s, when French and British threats became a substitute for strength, not a manifestation of it. The second word that we need to think a bit about, and it'll hardly come as any surprise because it's meant to be a big theme of this conference, is strategy itself. As status quo powers, the West has come to see strategy as a means to deal with threats. Counter is the word that we come up against so frequently. Those that are revisionist powers can see strategy in terms of the exploitation of opportunity. I was struck last night by Miriam Hirsch describing geopolitical risk as creating opportunities for AIG. That is not how Western states see geopolitical risk. And there is a further danger simply in that observation, and that is this. While the West continues to see strategy as a response to a threat, it will adopt a position that is essentially reactive rather than proactive, and that will therefore be behind the curve rather than ahead of it. That is a route which potentially condemns the West to perpetual escalation rather than to containment. Nowhere is that more evident, it seems to me, than in the Middle East at the moment, as earlier opportunities to scotch the snake were passed over in 2011 and in 2013, and even now, where the responses essentially do not match the scale of what is confronted, or indeed the scale of what is confronted as it is described to those at home. The distinction between what President Obama is saying and what General Dempsey is saying draws that point out very neatly. My third word stroke concept is the notion that the answer to all this is the use of advisors. We somehow seem to have fooled ourselves that advisors in Iraq are not soldiers, that they're not boots on the ground, that they are somehow non-competents. The message surely, both from the surge of 2007 and indeed from the successful training of the Afghan National Army, is that advisors cooperate with those whom they're advising, that they fight together rather than act as a backup situated somewhere in a base area, that it is precisely by cooperation in the field that those advisors attain the reach and leverage that they aspire to. My fourth word, a favorite word today in the current Western dialogue about strategic effect, is proxies. The point about military advisors is that they imply that the mass required in land warfare, the boots on the ground, will be generated not by the Western powers themselves, but by others. Proxies, like the junior allies of 1914, are not simply malleable instruments of the West's political will, but they are independent political actors with their own agendas. Proxies are not substitutes for national armed forces if the intention is to use armed conflict to pursue political objectives. My fifth word is insurgents. In Libya in 2011, proxies were insurgents bent on overthrowing the Gaddafi regime. The language with which the West frames the enemy can confuse the West's own political intent. Thanks to the success of the 2006 US Field Manual 3-24 on counterinsurgency, which essentially became a substitute for strategy itself, the West has tended to forget that Western powers have themselves frequently over the last decade acted as insurgents, bent on overthrowing existing regimes, not only in Libya, but also in Afghanistan in 2002 and Iraq in 2003, and potentially also, of course, in Syria today. To flip this argument, the linking of the words insurgency and terrorism with ISIL may obscure ends and means, obstructing our understanding of the ways in which irregular war can become regular and in which non-state actors aspire to become states and to control territory. And my sixth and last word, or two words, phrase, is hybrid warfare. Those of you who attended the excellent session yesterday on hybrid conflicts will have realized that there is no one definition of hybrid warfare. For some, and this goes back to 2006 when the word began to gain currency in US and increasingly in NATO debate, it was an operational method. For others, it is a catch-all title covering irregular warfare. And for NATO today, it is what the Russians have been doing in Crimea, in the Crimea and in Ukraine. What was striking in the session that followed hybrid warfare last night in the same room, that was the session that discussed military modernization, another very good session, was that the phrase hybrid warfare was not mentioned once. Bettino Rentz talked of low-intensity conflict, soft security threats, and asymmetric warfare, a phrase about which she was rightly also critical, and all the commentators were reluctant to draw long-term conclusions with regard to Russia's operational methods as a result of what had happened in Ukraine. For me, having taught at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst longer ago than I care to remember, but to be reasonably accurate, in 1978-79, the Russian use of force in 2014 was immediately redolent of what we then called Spetsnaz operations and the way in which they would function. My overall concern in highlighting these 6 words, groups of words, is a simple one. A label can too easily become a generalized substitute for an analysis of the specific methods applied in a particular context and can obscure rather than elucidate an understanding of what is going on militarily. That is particularly dangerous across a coalition when allies think they are speaking about the same things when in practice they are not. It can, of course, operate within individual states, between armed services, when again, different services can use the same words in different contexts. If those who think about war employ concepts which lack rigor, then we can hardly be surprised when states are confused in their approaches to the use of war or to the threat of the use of war. Thank you.
Yes, I think it was French author and philosopher Camus who said that there was nothing more important than naming things. If you get the name wrong, you're liable to get everything else wrong. And I think you gave us a very powerful reminder of how that applies also in our own field of endeavor. We have just half an hour, and I will recognize, my goodness, Alex, Tom, my goodness. My eyesight is not what it used to be. Me. Jim. Yeah, Michael, you must have misspoken. I see that Jim Thompson has raised his. Okay, well, that's perfectly manageable. I see that we have rumblings from the East China Sea. Okay, we have a round of 5, and hopefully we'll be able to do a second round after we've gone back to the panel first time. First, Alex Nichol.
Thank you, Francois. My question is for the Minister. You mentioned that in this situation that we're in now, that allies may need to accept that they have to rely on other allies for the provision of some capabilities. Clearly, there are within NATO important cooperation initiatives already, but we know that there still are quite a lot of domestic political barriers to that. So if it really is so important now, and I would agree with you, to cooperate much more effectively within Europe, how does one get over these domestic political barriers? I ask you as a politician, how do you do that?
Okay, second one at the very end. I'm not sure I read their name right. Yeah, that's you, sir. Yeah.
My name is Baumann. I'm from the Danish Broadcasting Corporation. A question to the minister, because ministers incorporate political will. At Newport, the heads of state and government decided to raise defense spending to 2% of the BNP, which they celebrated as a big decision. At the following press conference with my own Prime Minister from Denmark, she said that this was all right, but it didn't apply to Denmark, because Denmark is in the process of drawing down the budget with 3 billion Danish crowns, which is 15% of the budget. Now, the German Chancellor shared this decision, but her defense minister said immediately after that there could be no question of raising the German defense budget. My question is, how can decisions like that work at all if you can see the heads of state take a decision like that and immediately deny them in practice? Where does that leave the political will? Thank you.
Thank you. Very close to you, I think it's Kazmi.
Right, thank you, Chair. My question is to any of the panelists. It is an observation that in terms of naval military capability, US still, I think, commands the seas and has the ability to control the trade, while China perhaps has a regional naval capability. If we add NATO's power to the mix, China becomes a modest naval power. So, so to compensate or otherwise, it probably competes in the 5th generation warfare capability only. So what's your idea of military and conventional power balance between the two and NATO's role in it? Thank you.
Okay, Jim Thompson.
Also for the minister. So the title up there of this session is The Purposes and Extent of Western Strategic and Military Capacity. And you would think that one of those purposes would be to meet commitments to defend allies or peoples who you've made with commitments made in the past. And I think what you're hearing here from a few of us already is some skepticism about whether or not the decisions taken at Wales are consistent with those previous commitments. Now, it's possible you could say, well, maybe those previous commitments were unwise, but it's better to say that than to not act in a way as though they were wise, but yet speak in a way as though they were wise, but yet not act that way. So we have, you know, a rapid response force. I'm old enough now to have heard that many commitments to rapid response forces in the past. I begin to take their, like the Holy Roman Empire. It's a very similar, neither Holy nor Roman or Empire. So, you know, why not deploy forces to the Baltics? Why not deploy forces to Poland? And the excuse of, well, the 1997 agreement with Russia is, you know, long, you know, void. So why such a weak response by NATO in Wales?
Yes, we invented a new form of permanent presence, which is called a continuous presence. I think President Putin will have noted the difference. Chuang.
I have two questions. One first to the minister. I'm very interested in your last sentence of your speech. You say the last summit, NATO summit, fundamentally changed NATO. Am I right? Quoting you, because I think it's a very statement struck me. How NATO will fundamentally change for the last meeting from political organization to military organization or 2+. Will NATO become more aggressive or offensive, defensive? So it's a big change. Then my second question to Michael Rich. I'm very glad that you put China on the top 3 of your 8 points, 8-minute points. U.S.-China relations are very important, but could you explain more on the current status of U.S.-China relations briefly? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last one on this round, Jean-Claude Mallet.
Thank you, Chairman. I noted on the second list of Michael Rich that he alluded to terrorism, hybrid warfare, I would say asymmetrical warfare, and access denial. I wonder whether the classical NATO answer to the present situation is adapted to all these 3 sort of action. When you read General Gerasimov, when he writes in February 2013, he describes very precisely what the Russian army is going to do next year in Crimea. So what are the answers in military capabilities? Because this is one of the questions this morning. How do we confront situations in which special operations combined with the activation of internal opposition plus information warfare triggers destabilization, and this could be applied in territories which are territories under Article 5.
Thank you very much. Now back to the panel. Minister, you got a truckload of questions, so I'll have you go first rather than go in reverse order.
Thank you, and I'll try to answer them more or less. Yep. Now, I'll try to answer them more or less in the right order as well, and try to be as short as possible in order to have my colleagues at the panel also be able to answer their questions. Well, I think they were very good questions. To start with nickel first. Well, I think that the work that came out of Cardiff starts now. There are, as you say, a lot of initiatives in the alliance right now, whether it be the Framework Nations concept, or it be smart defense, or it be the new Joint Readiness Task Force, a lot of them. I think that what I described in my intervention is something that will come, whether allies like it or not, because we will not be able to maintain the full spectrum of military capabilities, each and one of us. I know it's a tricky question on the domestic political side to actually say that, well, when it comes to submarines, we'll trust a different country. And there are a lot of mechanisms that actually works against thinking like this. But if you see, or if you look at the picture of what has happened over the past years when it comes to cooperating on different capabilities, we see that there are actually 2 things that collides here. Because of the economic crisis, countries have a need to actually cooperate closer because they can't afford to buy it on their own. At the same time, because of the economic crisis, they need to put more orders into their own national defense industry, which of course is quite difficult to match. I do sense, however, a different traction now on these issues than compared with 4 to 5 years ago. I chaired the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee for the past 4 years in the Parliament, and the discussions we had in the beginning of that period is quite different from what we have now. And I do think that the sense of urgency is coming to allies. Also because whereas NATO and allies have been declining their budgets and investments due to the financial crisis, big countries outside of the alliance has gone the opposite way, and they have been strengthening their military capabilities. So I think that it will push itself forward, but I think that it will happen first and foremost when clusters of close allies go together doing things. You cannot expect 28 countries to be on the same page, but you can expect very close allies, close neighbors to be on the same page, and I think that is what is happening more now. Then to Bauman's question of the 2% goal. Well, I think it was a very good thing that the alliance in Cardiff actually managed to agree on substance when it comes to having the 2% goal as a 10-year achievement plan. And of course, countries are different. And I think that there are several issues that needs to be addressed, not only the 2% target. Firstly, we need to stop the cuts. I think that's the most important thing of all. Secondly, we need to abide by the 20% investment target. That's as important, I think, than the 2% spending target. If we do not invest in the right capabilities or decline our investment pace, that will be of a much bigger consequence in some years, I think, than the 2% target. Thirdly, we need to spend our resources wisely. If we spend 2% each year, but on completely wrong things, we will not get anywhere. So the combination of these three issues, I think, is extremely important, and no one country can say that we're exempted from this. We've all signed it, and it's a long-term goal, but it shows a direction, and I think that the 20% is also as important as the 2%, investing in modern capabilities that can be of use for the whole alliance and our ability to do collective defense, for instance. Then Thompson asks about the commitments to defend allies and if if we need new commitments or if we abide by the old commitments, and why not deploy forces to the Baltics and Poland. Well, we had a discussion leading up to the summit and also during the summit about the Founding Act, whether or not the Founding Act was something that could stop us from deploying forces, for instance, in the Baltics. And I think it's important to say that all the measures that NATO is now undertaking is well within the Founding Act. And people also tend to forget what the Founding Act was all about. The Founding Act is not all about not deploying troops in Baltic countries. It was about what we saw as the current and foreseeable security situation in Europe at that point. And that has also changed. That is no argument for putting aside the Founding Act. But my point is rather that this Founding Act discussion is not a static one. It is quite a dynamic one. And we are, alongside other allies now, just these days actually, deploying a mechanized infantry company to Latvia to do the Silver Arrow exercise and also prepare for the NRF. We do this because we want to reassure and we want to deter, and we do that alongside allies. And I was just in Riga a week ago discussing with my Latvian counterpart, and he also agreed that what the response is right now is something that makes them feel reassured and also makes us be able to give deterrence. Then lastly, the question that was pointed to me. My point was not that NATO has fundamentally changed, but that the security landscape in Europe has fundamentally changed. But I do think that it poses changes also for NATO. And what we've seen over the past months has been a very refocused NATO. My first ministerial in October of last year was quite different from the ministerial in June this year. And that is because it seems like a willingness for all allies to gather behind what we see as necessary means to both reassure, to deter, and to develop the alliance in the right direction. And what we have seen that came out of Cardiff, I think, is much more substantial and concrete than what we could have expected a year ago or maybe a year and a half ago. So that is why I think that it also changes NATO. It doesn't reinvent NATO in a way, but it changes NATO in the right direction. More focus on collective defense, something that we from Norway's side have been talking about since 2008 with the Core Area Initiative. This is something that we have wanted for a long time, and now things are happening at a far quicker pace than we could expect just some months ago. So I think that it pulls in the right direction. We're not finished. We can't say that we're satisfied with everything, but we are at least going in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You, Strachan.
Well, I don't think I have a direct question to answer, but I will just make a comment on the question about Article 5 and about the aggregation of NATO and American power in relation, naval power in relation to the Pacific. One of the problems of coming to this conference as a Scot has been precisely what the agenda would be, and could I cast my vote in time before I left? I was able to cast my vote, and I can't possibly tell you what I voted. But in the debate on Scottish defence over the last year, one of the questions that I have been wont to ask of Scots is if Scotland wanted to be in NATO, what did it understand by an Article 5 moment? And in particular, if there was an attack on the United States or on Canada on their western seaboards, would that be a moment when an independent Scotland would deploy its maritime power to the Pacific? And this was treated as a flippant question. Fortunately, it's an entirely hypothetical question now. But it was treated as a flippant question because the perception of Article 5 is that it's about the United States coming to the rescue of others rather than others going to the rescue of the United States. The one time Article 5, of course, was invoked was in George Robertson's Secretary Generalship after 9/11, and it was about other states coming to the rescue of the United States, even if the United States wasn't going to accept that rescue. And why I sort of use that example is precisely what are the limits of Article 5, where geographically does it reside, is NATO by implication as much now a Pacific alliance as an Atlantic alliance, despite its title, and what is it that Article 5 guarantees? I mean, the cyber attack issue was was raised in the context of Estonia. I don't have answers to those questions, but it does relate to the deterrent posture that NATO wants to adopt. And of course, ambiguity can enhance a deterrent posture because it creates uncertainty in the mind of an adversary, is the theory at least. And if a cyber attack is an Article 5 moment, then that might be a valuable area of ambiguity, or might be seen to be a valuable area of ambiguity. But by the same token, of course, after Ukraine, most East European countries and the new members of NATO and the Baltic states, of course, want clarity rather than ambiguity in order to enhance deterrence. And the maritime and Pacific dimensions only enhance that question. I'd be tempted, I'm not providing any answers to these dilemmas because I have no capacity to speak for NATO, but my answer, I think, in relation to the maritime question, if you were thinking of aggregation of forces, would be to focus the question on the Indian Ocean rather than on the Pacific, precisely because that's where it seems to me the potential interests of European powers and of, if you like, Asiatic powers converge.
Thank you very much. And Michael?
Three quick items. I was asked about the adequacy of the current maritime balance of power, and I think the questioner got the objective right: open lanes for transit and goods. And the current balance has been quite successful for a long time in maintaining that reaching and maintaining that objective to the benefit of many, many nations around the world, including China. But military capability is not something to be assessed in a static manner. You always must do it in a dynamic fashion. And the concern is that the anti-access area denial capabilities being developed and deployed by China have the potential to limit free and open transit, and thus, I think, belong on the list of dangers that need to be watched. Now, with regard to U.S.-China relations, there are many experts in this room, so I need to be cautious about speaking about this topic, but I regard the relationship as a work in progress. There are many global problems that would resource conservation, disease eradication and prevention, violent extremism and the spread of it that would benefit from a closer, more constructive relationship between China and the United States. We don't have that to the extent possible, so I regard it as a work in progress. And maybe I'll stop there to allow other questions.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, all three of you. I'm going to have to stop this debate, which could go on for a long time, and indeed is a permanent debate within the Institute. I'll ask you to stay seated just for a few moments while I give the traditional chairman's envoi at the end of the conference. We're going to close in a few minutes here, but before we do that, I'd like to say a few words of substance and of process involving, of course, the Institute. The last time we met here in Oslo, as I said yesterday, was 25 years ago, quarter of a century, same time of the year. The rumblings of the enormous earthquake, which was beginning to shake up the Soviet Empire, those rumblings were becoming very, very loud indeed. We, at the Institute, we had been doing our homework for some years, and we had, I think, a relatively clear understanding of the scope of what was going to happen, if, of course, not the details. In those days, it was about one giant earthquake involving one immense region, transforming the global geostrategic order. We had the globalization of globalization, made possible by the dual movement of China into market economics, and the end of the Soviet Empire, with the end of the Soviet Union itself. And indeed, the establishment of a world system, for want of a better word, which, despite all of its warts, its difficulties, its drawbacks, and so on and so forth, had an enormous saving grace, and that is, we were no longer living under the looming shadow of what could have been the Third World War. That was then. Today, and I think this came across in our proceedings here in the last 2 days, this sort of sense that the system is transforming again. But this is not happening through one giant earthquake. It's happening through a multiplicity of tremors, of flashpoints. Ukraine, IISS, South China Sea, and other disputes in the region, the Sahel, and a multiplicity of substantial disturbances. And this is summarized in the latest issue of Strategic Survey, which has literally just come out of the presses. This is summarized in a phrase, which is 2014, it's the return of geopolitics. That's the way it's summarized. And I will say only three things. My list is shorter than that of you and Michael, but then the question is not identical. Say three things here. First of all, and I will repeat one point which has already been made by Sarah Rain, picked up by you, Strachan, and that is interdependence is not an impediment to war. This is a question which has come up repeatedly over the last years. You know, whenever one would be speaking to a group of students, you'd always get the question, but you know, is large-scale conflict really imaginable given the process of globalization and the multiplicity of interdependence? And we have an answer of sorts, and unfortunately it's not the right answer in the case of Russia and Ukraine. Second point, which is drawn from what happened in 1914, and this is that actions by statesmen, by governments, were, as one puts it in political science, were to a large extent path-dependent. That's fairly classical. But we often assume that path dependency is largely or mainly about the past. Some people call this past dependency, and that of course does exist. But in the case of 1914, and what we see again today, is that path dependency is future-oriented rather than past-oriented. In the case of 1914, the assumptions in Germany, in Austria-Hungary, in France, in Britain, were all about the rise of Russia. How was the military, economic rise of Russia going to influence Russia's role, its alliances, its antagonisms? And it helped create the situation which eventually developed into full-blown war at the end of July 1914. Today, China is playing very much that role. It's the development of China, its emergence, the prospect that it will eventually become a military power as great as that of the United States of America. The IISS has done some serious work on that. It may all be true. Although in 1914 it wasn't, but if it wasn't true, it's also because the First World War destroyed Russia, the Tsarist Empire. In other words, we have to be careful and conscious, not simply about our use of analogies, historical analogies, we also have to be careful about the way we factor in assumptions about the future, which are by definition unprovable, into our own actions. Of course, one has to do this to some extent, but we should not be a slave to it, and we should be very careful to remember at all stages that these remain largely hypothetical. Third point, and I'm glad you, Strachan, raised it. This is what is sometimes called reverse Article 5, what some people call the Guam scenario. A Chinese rocket falls on Guam because there's been a problem between Japan and China, and the US has taken fait cause for Japan, and so on. And then you ask the question to this or that representative of a NATO country, and you ask him, what are you going to do if Guam is hit? And the person sort of looks at you with goggle eyes and saying, what does this have to do with me? Well, the only time we invoked Article 5 was when there was an attack against American territory by an armed aggression on 11th of September 2001. So it's not as hypothetical as some may assume, and it's not only you, unfortunately, your Scottish interlocutors, who don't take this seriously enough. In 1914, it was the great coupling of alliances which helped lead to a situation in which World War became possible. For the moment, we are in a situation of non-awareness of couplings. And we also have to be careful there, because although we may not be fully aware of them, they actually do exist. And in a time of crisis, the way their existence is fulfilled in practice or isn't will have a major impact on crisis management. Now, today, as 25 years ago, the challenge for the Institute is twofold. And I'll define it first in the negative and then in the positive. And here again, I will lift from strategic survey. What we are trying to do is not an attempt to forecast future years' events, but to provide pointers to help think about the future based on what we know so far. That is one part of our remit. The other part of our ambition is to set the terms of the debate, of the discussion, to be those who name, to come back to the earlier part of our discussion. This was the Institute's enormous contribution during the Cold War. It was the Institute's success in the passage from Cold War to post-Cold War, and it is, for example, what we see with the Institute's work in ventures such as the Shangri-La Dialogue. We are helping shape the terms of the debate. And our ability to do this in the future, I think, is based on very solid ground. We have a Class A, no, not Class A, Class A++, research team. We have a membership, and you are a cross-section of that membership, which is excellent and which contributes in all sorts of ways to the ability of the Institute to think and to project itself into the debate and to shape the debate. You have also noted that in a substantial part of our proceedings, council members have been prominent in the discussion, but some of these council members are rather unlike those we used to have 20 or 25 years ago. The globalization of the Institute is now clearly to be seen from the way we conduct also our own intellectual governance. And of course, we have not only adapted to globalization in terms of research capability, in terms of our membership, in terms of our governance, but, and I had already mentioned Shangri-La, but I can also mention the Manama Dialogue, we have also globalized our ability to shape the debate globally. We used to have an annual conference, and the Global Strategic Review is an offspring of our annual conference, but we also have in parallel these enormously important dialogues in regions in which there did not exist the machinery for constructive debate, even at the intergovernmental level. We have, in effect, not only been helping shape debate, but in some ways helping shape the machinery through which governments can engage fruitfully and productively. This is not something which was initially foreseen by the creators of the Institute. And this has been a great success, and it also provides me a good starting point for the most pleasant part, from my standpoint, of the envoi, and that is the giving of thanks. Giving of thanks before I get to the Institute, the Institutniks. First, our thanks to all of our friends in Norway. The Foreign Ministry of Norway, the Foreign Ministry of Sweden, since this is a rotating feast. Statoil, along with non-Norwegian sponsors, whose names you can see in front of you. And one person in particular I would want to single out, and that is our Norwegian council member, Grace Skaugen, who really made it possible for us to be so well received. And I would want all of us to give a round of applause to our Norwegian friends and to Grace. The Institute, the Institutniks. First of all, I mentioned the dialogues. The dialogues would not have happened if it hadn't been for John Chipman, the Director General of the Institute. He and his staff, the research staff, the support staff, have all not only been doing fantastic work, but here in Oslo, you have seen their footprints, use that in the most positive sense, everywhere in everything that we have been doing over the last 2 days. You've seen it in the contribution of the research staff members in the various meetings that we have been holding here. You have been able to judge the individual quality as well as the collective quality of our research staff. The support staff have made our life incredibly easy. One of the privileges, well, maybe not the right word, one of the privileges of the chairman is that when somebody is very, very unhappy with the way things have been going, I get to hear about it. Well, I didn't hear anything of it. I didn't hear anything here in Oslo. So I assume that thanks to a large extent to the staff of the Institute, that this has indeed been the case. And here again, I would wish to give a round of applause to all of those who have helped make this conference a success, to John Chipman, to the staff of the Institute, and also to the staff of this hotel who have made our life comfortable. Thank you. And just in case I gave the wrong impression, because I said we had met the last time here in Oslo 25 years ago, don't draw the conclusion that it will be another 25 years before we meet again in Oslo. It could be a lot sooner. Watch that space. A housekeeping word. As a good Frenchman, I always focus on what we are going to eat. We're all going to have lunch, but council members will have to work for their lunch, and they will be meeting in the Kunstroom immediately after my envoi. On this gastronomical point, once again, thank you all. Thanks for the great work which has been done. This has been, from my standpoint, and I hope it is shared, one of the most exciting conferences that we have had at the Institute for a long time. Thank you all. Et bon appétit.